Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Gray. I'm the director of the Institute of Irish Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here to today's book launch of Ireland 1922, Independence, Partition and Civil War, edited by Dara Gannon and Fearghal McGarry. So just a little bit about format and the running order before we start. So this is a hybrid event. It's always slightly tricky to pull off. So we have an audience here in the palatial splendour of the Great Hall at Queen's. So you're very welcome if you've joined us in person. And we have a lot of people who are joining us through Microsoft Teams online. I hope you can hear me if you're joining us online. Just shout out if you can't. We are recording this meeting, so if you don't want to appear in the recording, just turn your camera off. And also, if you could mute your microphone if you're joining us online, if you haven't already done so, that will hopefully stop us getting any feedback. So the format is we're going to hear.
You know your
a little bit of feedback there.
I don't know it offhand, but I could get
whoever's microphone live, if you wouldn't mind just turning it off, that would be great. Okay, so the format is we're going to hear from the book's editors. As you may know, the book is a collection of 50 or 52, I think, our contribution from 52 historians, literary scholars, commentators, all sorts of people. So we're going to hear from the editors who will talk about the themes of the book. But before that, Dr. Margaret O'Callaghan from Queen's is going to introduce the book to us, give us a sense of what it's about and why this is such a timely contribution. We do have, for those of you who are with us in the hall, we do have some copies of the book at the back with our friends from No Alibis Bookshop here who have brought some discounted copies. So if what you hear from the front of the hall inspires you, please make your way to the back of the hall afterwards, and there'll be an opportunity to purchase the book. For those of you who are joining us online, the book is available from the Royal Irish Academy. So if you go to the Royal Irish Academy website and go to their publications pages, you'll find an opportunity to purchase the book directly from the Academy, or indeed it's available, as I say, in all good bookshops. Okay, so without further ado, what I'm going to do is introduce our first speaker, who's Dr. Margaret O'Callaghan. Margaret is a reader in history at Queen's University Belfast, specialising in late 19th and 20th century Irish history, particularly political history and cultural politics. Margaret has published widely in this area, including her books, British High Politics and a Nationalist Ireland, Land and Law under Forster and Balfour, from 1994, and 1916 and 1966, commemorating the Easter Rising, published in 2007. And Margaret's published particularly widely on the commemorative agenda of the Decade of Centenaries. So no one better, I think, to speak to us about what this book is about and to give us an overview of it. So Margaret, if I can invite you just to come to the podium. We'll get you on camera. And hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Peter. Thank you very much. And it's an honour to be asked to launch this amazingly beautiful book. It's incredible. It's a beautiful cover, it's a beautiful design. It's loads of most amazing photographs, most of which I've never seen before. So the most important, well, not the most important thing, but an important thing about this book is it is a thing of great beauty. And I put it aside so don't spill water on it. So the book's entitled Ireland 1922, Independence, Partition, Civil War. And as Peter Gray said, it's edited by Dara Gannon and Fearghal McGarry. Both of his parish, and Darragh's also occasionally of another. We're delighted to be able to launch the book here today. And I think the most important thing to say about it is it's a collection of interdisciplinary essays published by the Royal Irish Academy published in fact just last month. And this is its first official launch, I think, isn't it? So we're delighted to do it here today. Both editors, as Peter said, will speak to the book's themes and approaches. I'll say something about 1922, the general background from which it's come, and make some points on what the kind of contribution it makes. I've said it's beautiful, but I think it's important to say it's a characteristically beautiful production from the Royal Irish Academy. Their books are incredible. The team led by Ruth Whelan, with the editor Kalina King and the designer Fidelma Slattery, have produced some of the most impressive, unusual, insightful books that I've seen for years. And here again, they've done a magnificent job. The standard and the range and the quality of the photographic reproductions of extraordinary material. As I said, much of it I've never seen before. It encompasses photos from the time, posters, billboards, cartoon, graffiti on prison cells, reproductions of billboards from meetings, and statues from Lisburn. It's all detailed in the range of listed sources, some of which are the National Library of Ireland, but there are a whole load of others. It's amazing visually. As Ruth Hegarty, the overall editor's forward states, this is 50 essays, 50 contributions, one seminal year, 1922. So as we know, the so-called Anglo-Irish Treaty had been signed in December 1921. And 1922 was a momentous year, but it's a strange year, because it's a year people don't talk about very much, though it was a crucial one. I'll think about it from the point of view of here initially. James Craig had already got an administration in Belfast for Northern Ireland before the truce of the summer of 21. In fact, before the handover of Dublin Castle, after the treaty, in January of 22. We've essays here in this collection on Belfast in 1922, on the killing of Sir Henry Wilson in London, on the McMahon murders, on the raising of a monument to Nicholson in Lisburn, the imperial hero of what imperialists call the Indian Mutiny. To move to the south, Brian Hanley writes of Free State murders of anti-treaty young men in Dublin, anticipating later events in Kerry during the height of the Civil War. The handover of Dublin Castle had restricted meaning for Craig and his ministers and administration in January of 1922, because they had already been handed over many of the powers to preside over their new entity of Northern Ireland. The end of Dublin Castle is here this month, however, as is Mark McGuire's essay, which is tantalising on this. Northern Ireland as an entity could be seen for unionists, if not nationalists, as a political Noah's Ark, dropping in before the handover, bearing out the luckiest of unionists into a protected land. But the Treaty of 21 was negotiated by a team apparently negotiating on behalf of all of Ireland, and provided for specific Ulster counties to move to exclude themselves from the terms of that treaty by December 22. So January 22 was a time of anxiety for Craig. This changed the game radically for him. He had assumed his battle for Ulster was won when he had secured 6 counties in that symbolic moment of the King's speech in Belfast in June 21. But now, after the truce and after the treaty that followed it, and the truce was never very evident on the ground in Ulster in any case, the permanence Craig thought he had won for his new entity was thrown up in the air by the terms of the treaty. The Clause 12 option in the treaty seemed clearly, infuriatingly from Craig's point of view, to open up the ostensibly signed, sealed and delivered partition question. Those crucial clauses provide for a boundary commission, at least in theory, could consult the wishes of the inhabitants in the light of economic and geographic conditions unspecified. In view of the electoral record of the previous decade, this could potentially change the lie of the new border. So, from the point of view of Craig and his supporters, his aims are not over. His job begins again in January 1922. First past the post, mass complex demographic facts. Here in this incredible volume, Tim Wilson, Lawrence Marley, Robert Lynch, and Stephen O'Neill look at aspects of Craig's strategies and tactics. Brandon McSivna looks from over the new border in Donegal. Big houses and their fate, burning in many cases. The end of the RUC, land hunger, they're all here in exquisite essays in vignette form. And the vignette essay is a very clever way to open up an area. I think the two editors may have started a trend for the very short essay. Creven McGarry looks at the emotional register of the treaty debates. Love, hate, passion, fear, trust, terror. The emotions associated with the handing over the colours of the disbanded Irish regiments to the King are illuminated by Heather Jones. Marie Coleman and others repudiate simplistic lines that seek to depoliticize the politics of women in the treaty debates. The book seeks also not to repeat the notion that there are two corralled civil wars going on in this island at different times. It cumulatively builds through separate pieces to suggest that all of the island must be seen together in relation to Britain. There is more than usual in studies of Ireland in 1922 on the new Northern Ireland because of this focus, right up to the summer of 22. But as the editors comment in their introduction, while we have insights into mentalities, practices and actions of IRA volunteers through the Bureau of Military History and the pensions files, we still lack insight into the mentalities and structure, culture and organisation of a variety of ground-level movements in the North, including the Special Constabulary, due to a lack of availability of crucial archival material. In favour of the Northern polity is not centrally highlighted here. Securing his interpretation of the meaning of violence in Ulster in London was to become crucial to Craig, though, crucial for securing further military supplies and licence from London in the name of security. This is the context through which essays in the book help us to understand the Craig Collins pacts of early 22. Warring over the representation, sources of, and responsibility for violence in Ulster was to dog Craig for years, even allowing for an active IRA, which they were under Collins's direction, for core months in the first half of 1922. The proportion of Catholic deaths at the hands of security forces and nameless others was disproportionate. The IRA were active, and counter gangs confronted shipyard workers in Belfast in this period. Henry Patterson's recent paper on the burning and driving out of Catholic businesses from Bangor suggests that this was responded to by a unionist idea that specials or their equivalents were potentially protection for Catholics, a model for later conciliation committees. How is this so far at variance with the view that most Catholics took of them and of the constabulary at Grand Square Barracks in particular? There is serious consideration in London to not giving Craig all that he needs to keep his regime put steady, particularly around April 1922. The book's introduction emphasises how nobody in the past really wanted to remember 1922. Or rather, nobody in the past really wanted to explore in minute detail its occurrences, because many of them are very dark. Maybe we need to do so, and this book is a brilliant part of that process. Here, commemoration and history writing pull apart, and also, I suppose, can come together, because neither entity, the Free State nor Northern Ireland, wish to commemorate, highlight, celebrate, or promote the image of their actions and their hard draconian military establishments in 1922. As the editors powerfully argue, historians too seem to have shied away from exploring and examining the events of this black year, as the introduction points out. For most of those who took part in the treaty debates, partition did not seem a permanent reality. The Boundary Commission left that door open for the near future. For Craig, fear of losing what he thought he'd secured drove him on relentlessly. The deaths of Collins and Griffith were transformative politically. Internment north and south was clearly brutal. You know, Halpin's essay points out how marginalised Arthur Griffith became in both commemoration and history writing after his death. The ferment of intellectual debate from the immediate post-Parnellite period up to the First World War, referred to in an excellent essay by Richard Burke, had relied heavily on the platform of Griffith's brilliant newspapers, particularly United Irishmen, to conduct debates about all of the core issues to determine what the new Ireland might be. This book is exciting and provocative, thought-provoking and surprising. It encompasses music and dance, theatre, and is above all an interdisciplinary collection, though historians do dominate. The outcome of 1922 was not predictable or inevitable. Winston Churchill's interventions at Belief in Petticoat indicated a shift in British policy in terms of backing Craig hard. Thoughts of ditching Craig in the Northern government, as had been toyed with by London earlier in the year, were put aside. Collins was more and more corralled as June 22 approached, and shelling of war courts was very marginally a Free State decision. This book gives us vignettes and glancing perspectives, images and suggestive thoughts. It's a brilliant model and a great book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for that fantastic introduction to the book. It's a pleasure now to call on my colleague and friend, Fearghal McGarry, to speak next. Fearghal is Professor of 20th Century Irish History here at Queen's. He's published very widely on the revolutionary and indeed post-revolutionary periods in Ireland, including monographs on Frank Ryan, on Owen O'Duffy, on the Rising, Easter 1916, on the Abbey Rebels of 1916, and also he's edited numerous editions of sources and essays. He's former editor of Irish Historical Studies, and in recent years he's been heavily involved in the commemorative agenda, including working with An Post in establishing the GPO Witness History Museum in Dublin, and also several projects with the Ulster Museum here in Belfast. He was the director of the AHRC-funded project, A Global History of Irish Revolution, 2017 to 2021. And he is the co-editor of the book that we're launching today. So, Fearghal, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. I'm going to speak today for a short while on how 1922 has been remembered by the public and written about by the historians, because it's a launch as well as a seminar. I'm going to take the chance to say a few thank yous at the outset. So I'm really grateful to Margaret for launching the book so brilliantly, and it's no easy task to say something about a book that spans 50 different essays, but she really excellently identified, I think, some of the key themes across the book. So I'm grateful for that. Thanks to Dara, who I haven't seen for some while now, long-suffering co-editor who did a lot of the crawling of 50 contributors. And probably just as difficult a task could have been working with me over a year or two on this project. The Royal Irish Academy were brilliant to work with, particularly Ruth Hegarty, the managing editor, the production editor, Helena King, and also the brilliant designer, Elma Slattery, who's the creative or aesthetic genius behind this book. And from the outset, we wanted a book that would be very much driven by design and imagery, and we were really lucky that she could work on the publication. Almost all our contributors, who I'd like to thank, some of them I'm sure are watching online, signed on almost immediately and responded in really interesting and innovative ways to what was actually a very vague brief that we gave to them, which Darragh might say something a little bit about later. And finally, thanks to Peter Bray for hosting this event, to Kathy Devlin for helping to organise it, and to David Torrance and Natasha from Alibis around the corner, our little bookshop. And thanks to our audience here. I think this is the first in-person event we've done of this scale for quite a long time, so it's great to have people back in the room, and thanks for people tuning in online. So what can we say about the memory of 1922? 1922 was, and I think it's safe to say, is an awkward year in terms of its public remembrance, whether by the new states that were being created at that time, or more broadly by different political groups, and indeed the general public. Although lots of memorable things happened, treaty, debates, ratification of the treaty, the outbreak of the Civil War, the killing of Margaret Collins, the establishment of the Irish Free State. Paradoxically, when you look at the year as a whole, or that particular era, it's not well remembered. And the reason for this is, of course, the contested nature of the key events of the year that our book focuses on. The formation of the two new states, the Civil War, and the sort of the solidification of partition. These are deeply awkward things to remember in any kind of formal setting or way. Pro-treatyites, for example, had little interest in commemorating the Civil War, which was not politically useful if the aim was to widely support the legitimacy of the new state. And that was a point which was really interestingly made just a few days ago by Commandant Stephen McGarry, who noted how the Irish state finds it easier to remember the British war dead, or the British Army fatalities of Easter 1916, than it does its own Civil War dead, which is a really interesting intervention to come from that particular source. The Irish government's current plans to mark the Civil War, which were shaped by the expert advisory group, is to have a single ceremony not linked to any historical event taking place before the centenary of the state executions, which makes clear how the continuing sensitivities that have to be navigated around that conflict. And indeed, most of the key events of 1922, the ratification of the treaty, the establishment of the Free State, were not actually commemorated by the state itself over the last century, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it, because Fianna Fáil was usually in power, and effectively, obscured commemorations to mark the origins of its own state, or at least the state which it administered. Instead, linking the new state's origins to Easter 1916 proved much more useful method, even if commemoration of Easter Rising is clearly contested between sections. And indeed, commemoration of Easter 1916 remains contested, as is demonstrated by the recent decision just a couple of days ago to remove the shared history memorial at Glasnevin. But, difficult to remember 1916 is or was. Remembering the Civil War was even more fraught. And interestingly, north of the border, you see similar at work. Unionist politicians chose not to commemorate the violence that actually secured the Northern state, overlooking the communal violence, or the Belfast pogrom of 1920 to 1922. They instead remembered the struggle against Home Rule as represented by the iconic Ulster Covenant and Ulster Volunteers. And just as down south, they remembered a more useful blood sacrifice. Actually marks the year in which the unveiling of First World War memorials peaked across Northern Ireland, and it was these Orange and Imperial and Unionist acts of remembrance, rather than events marking the actual events leading to the birth of the state, that provided Northern Ireland's foundational rituals. Commemorating the new state through loyalist forms of remembrance very conveniently and usefully elided the presence of its large Catholic minority, mirroring the political processes of exclusion that were at work in the new state. So subsequently, two collective memories of Northern Irish state formation emerged years ago. The Unionist narrative of a state under siege that preserved Ulster for Britain and Empire, and the nationalist memory centred on the communal violence of the Belfast pogrom, the collapse of the Northern IRA, which takes place in the spring of 1922, and a more general sense of abandonment of the Irish Free State made for a traumatic nationalist memory of 1922, which remains a sensitive issue to this day. So north and south, there was no appetite to acknowledge the violence that accompanied the state formation. Notorious killings, which Margaret has touched on, such as the McMahon family killings in North Belfast by Northern Irish state forces, or the massacre of Protestants by the IRA in Bandon or Alt Levey, were not easily reconciled with the narratives of sacrifice promoted in both states. Partition was also formally confirmed in 1922 when Northern Ireland left the Free State settlement at the end of that year. But it was not commemorated. As Robert Lynch notes, there are no monuments to partition, just to other state narratives of revolution or resistance. Even amongst Unionists, there was little appetite to commemorate a border which cut across Protestant communities and institutions as indiscriminately as Catholic and nationalist ones. A striking feature of the Northern Ireland Office's Our Story in the Making website is its inability to even mention the word partition. There's no room in its storytelling for the one about the border, as Stephen O'Neill has remarked. And future scholars looking back on the centenary that we're living through this year and last year would probably find the events that didn't occur, the centenary stone that wasn't laid at Stormont, President Higgins' non-appearance at Armagh. These events as among the most interesting commemorations of the decade. It's very difficult to commemorate events as history if they're still part of our living present. South of the border, as Ireland gradually became modern, the memory of 1922 became tainted in another way. The idea that Ireland's unfinished revolution fell short of the emancipatory ideals expected of independence has been increasingly articulated in recent decades. Ken Loach's Wind That Shakes the Barley, and I'm a firm believer that films reflect a public understanding of the past more than history textbooks. Loach's film depicts 1922 as a wrong turn that saw British rule replaced by the homegrown repression of church and state. Michael Moran, in John McGahern's novel Amongst Women, reflects bitterly on the outcome of the fight for freedom. What was it all for? The whole thing was a cod. Public remembrance of 1922 remains difficult because the instinct, perhaps even the necessity to officially mark the formation of the Irish state in a dignified fashion, as occurred at Dublin Castle last month, continues to be destabilised, not so much by the legacy of historical events, such as the Civil War, but rather the events which have yet to pass into history, most notably partition. Turning now from public memory of 1922 to history writing of 1922, we can see similar themes at work during similar periods. A little bit of a time lag. I think the artists and the writers usually get there first, but the historians trailing after. Certainly, disillusionment and disappointment feature strongly in the military service pension collection, which Margaret has referred to, which historians have been using now for some time to reconsider the history of the revolutionary era. These themes are also central to the emerging gendered historiographies, accounts of the marginalisation of women, the mistreatment of the poor and other vulnerable citizens that we've seen in the last decade or two. And indeed, that have become such an important part of the decade of centenary. So again, history and commemoration coming together in really interesting ways. It's interesting how much of this historical writing a century on could be considered as new history, stories that went untold by historians at least. If 1922 was consigned to what Guy Biner terms a forgetful public remembrance in his essay on forgetting 1922 in our volume, something similar could be said about the neglect of this year by historians. Compared with the vast scholarship on Easter 1916 and the War of Independence, far fewer accounts focused on state building, partition, or the Civil War, although that's now fast changing, including notably partition, which has been transformed by so many major studies in just the last few years, which I think is very revealing of another kind of commemorative moment in how things now are changing in terms of everyday politics rather than reflecting on a century ago. But until recently, little was written on events in Ulster by historians. Northern Republicans had no desire to write about a traumatic defeat. Northern Unionists showed little interest in recording the establishment of their own state. There was no Ulster equivalent of the Bureau of Military History. And as Margaret has mentioned, it's really extraordinary that the archives of the Ulster Special Constabulary 100 years later are still closed to historians and to the public. It was challenging for the first Unionist historians of Northern state formation to write narratives legitimising a state that up until a few years before they had never actually sought. Eventually, or not eventually, actually quite quickly, a mirror version of nationalist historiography that told the story of the Catholic people with a distinct cultural identity that had struggled over 4 centuries for a freedom also took form within Unionist historical writing. Accounts such as Ronald McNeill's Ulster Stand for Union, which was actually published in 1922, went back to the Ulster plantation as the foundation of the 2 Irelands that were created in 1922. In contrast, half a century later, we see the first wave of academic scholarship on the state formation on both sides of the Irish border. And the first academic works on Northern state formation from the 1970s, although much of it was written by historians sympathetic to unionism, was deeply critical about that process. Patrick Buckland's account, for example, the first serious study of the establishment of the Northern Ireland state, was subtitled The Factory of Grievances. Early historiography of the Irish Free State was also grounded in division and disappointment. Accounts by veterans such as P.S. O'Hegarty's pro-treaty, The Victory of Sinn Féin, and equally Dorothy McArdle's anti-treaty account, The Irish Republic, sought to attribute blame for the Irish Civil War, and there was plenty to go around. Interestingly, the revisionist historiography that we get then half a century later that emerges from the 1970s tended to endorse one side of that political debate, that is treatyite interpretations. Books such as FSL Lyon's Ireland Since the Famine emphasised Cumann na Gael's state-building achievements, criticising the anti-democratic actions and particularly mentality of anti-treaty Republicans. The highlight of this historiographical era was Tom Garvin's revealingly titled 1922, The Birth of Irish Democracy, which saw 1922 as marking, to quote Tom, the triumph of the democratic impulse in Irish life over the cult of the virtuous minority. And you know, with the distance of half a century Now it's very easy to see how the shadow of the Troubles is shaping this historiography. Now the idea of 1922 as marking the birth of Irish democracy has given way to much more nuanced interpretations, emphasising the role of British forces in imposing the Irish settlements of 1920 and 1922, and also in limiting the potential for compromise between republicans. These accounts are also much more attuned to independent Ireland's shortcomings, a legacy which is still unfolding today in relation to institutions such as the mother and baby homes, which informed the re-evaluation of the achievements of 1922 by the latest generation of historians. Although in her account in the Cambridge History of Ireland, Anne Dolan asks the very interesting question of whether this historiography of disillusionment, which emerges with revisionism, is in part a retrospective reading back of dissatisfaction with the Ireland that had emerged half a century later. And certainly, whatever the shortcomings of the different revolutionaries on either side of the events of 1922, the Irish state builders and their successors in the 1930s saw themselves as implementing republican ideals as they understood them, and many on both sides of the treaty divide shared values that now elicit far less admiration, particularly in relation to ideas such as gender and class. 100 years on, it's easy to overlook the extent to which the future of Ireland seemed far more open at the beginning of 1922 than it would by the end of the year. And one of the things that struck me, assembling these essays together over the course of the year, was the extent to which events appeared so open at the outset of 1922, in a way which they don't now to us, because the outcome of the formation of the two states and the fact that those two states endured for so long, I think created a sort of a retrospective aura of stability over an air of kind of inevitability about what happened in 1922 that just wasn't apparent to many of the political actors at the time. For much of 1922, it wasn't clear that the treaty settlement, north or south, would stick. And for some, of course, the political questions that I've focused on today didn't much intrude into more pressing daily concerns. And our book also tries to incorporate those human stories in terms of issues such as poverty, everyday life, and so on, and the kind of events in which politics often was an unwelcome intrusion into other kinds of daily struggles and concerns. So to sum up, our book aims to convey something of the diversity of political and human experiences encountered in 1922. It's an effort, to quote President Higgins, to remember the events of 100 years ago with an openness to the voices and stories of those who might constitute as the other, the stranger, the enemy of yesterday. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fearghal. So we're going to move on to our second joint editor, Dr. Dara Gannon, who's now, it's great to have Dara back in Queen's. seems like such a long time since you've been away. Dara's now lecturer in Irish Studies at University College Dublin, and he's the Vice President of the Global Irish Diaspora Congress. And before that, he was currently with us here as the Research Fellow on the Global History of Irish Revolution project, working with Fearghal. He's also been an ICUF Beacon Fellow at the University of Toronto. And he's published widely on the history of the Irish diaspora and the revolution and the relationship between the two, including his books Proclaiming a Republic, Ireland 1916 and the National Collection from 2016, and Conflict, Diaspora and Empire, Irish Nationalism in Great Britain, 1912 to 22, which came out last year in 2021. And he's currently completing a monograph entitled Worlds of Revolution, Ireland's Global Moment, 1919 to 1923. So Darragh, great to have you back. Over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and thank you and the Institute of Irish Studies for agreeing to host us for this inaugural launch. I'm most grateful to Margaret for giving so generously of both time and thought this afternoon to, as Fearghal mentioned, an expansive book to review. So thank you so much to Margaret. A book of the scale opens as many acknowledgements as it does pages. I'm first and foremost indebted to Ruth Hegarty, the managing editor of the Royal Irish Academy, for the steadfast belief in this project Ruth has provided unerring support and necessary perspective throughout this process, and for that we are most grateful. I would like to especially acknowledge Helena King, Fidelma Slattery, Porrick Dempsey, Valeria Cavalli, whose continued patience and professionalism helped deliver this book to completion. Thanks are also due to Dr. Bobby Nolan, who was a key part of the team, the original team, in bringing this volume together. It would be remiss of me not to thank my co-editor, co-conspirator, perhaps, Fearghal McGarry, who really assuredly brought this volume from concept to completion, championing it at every stage. So I'm most grateful for his support. I think it's particularly apt that we are launching this volume in Belfast. As Fearghal may remember, many of the ideas, the concepts, the conversations which brought this volume to fruition were born in Queens, in the Queen's Quarter, no less, over coffees in Junction, French Village, and the occasional coffee at Woodworkers. It's also important to recognise the contribution of Queens in an academic context. 3 contributors from Queens who are currently based here. Fearghal, of course, Marie Coleman and Andrew Holmes have essays in this volume, and a further 9 contributors from the Queen's diaspora are also contributors to this volume. So I think this testifies to the multidisciplinary emphasis which is espoused here at Queen's, specifically at HAP. This collaborative multidisciplinary emphasis really rings true in this volume. Now, in 1989, Roy Foster, in his magisterial Modern Ireland, discussed the idea of varieties of Irishness. And he stated that Ireland, quote, was characterised by a fragmented polity, varieties of people defining their Irishness differently, unquote. And that is perhaps one of the core organising principles of this volume, which I think in many ways is a statement of postmodern Ireland in response to Roy Foster's volume entitled Modern Ireland. And by that, I mean the nature of the contributions of our 50 contributors. So as we've heard already, we have 50 contributors who were asked to identify a key episode which spoke in microcosm to a broader theme which addressed the issues of 1922, but also ranged widely over the period of the revolutionary period and beyond. And our overarching framework of the themes of independence, partition and civil war thereafter essentially espoused a wide range of thematic important going forward. We find that a very healthy way in which to think about this year, Ireland 1922. And as we mentioned in the introduction, this moves away from an established meta-narrative of what Ireland 1922 was, what it should be. Even from an editorial point of view, we were guided by the research, by the ideas, and by the emphasis which our contributors brought to the table. So this was an experiment of sorts in a multidisciplinary volume, and I think it speaks to the development of ideas over a longer gestation, to use Roy Foster's term again, of this decade of centenaries. This is the fruits of a 10-year decade of centenaries. Now, the multidisciplinary nature and this statement, which I hope we've made in terms of postmodern Irish historiography, can be identified in the wide disciplines which are invoked in this volume, spanning cultural studies, heritage, history, design, film, gender, law, literature, memory, political science, visual culture, and more. And through these new perspectives and these different disciplines, I think we present, as Ruth Hegarty notes aptly in her foreword, a mosaic rather than a master narrative of Ireland 1922. Now, I'd like to just address 2 key themes in my remarks, which I think attest to this idea of new directions in Irish historiography, specifically this idea of a statement of postmodern Ireland. The issue of Ulster, broadly framed, is of course something which we've been talking about a lot over the last year specifically, and one eminent scholar has described partition as a process rather than an event. And of course I refer to our respondent this afternoon, Margaret O'Callaghan. I think it's also important to recognise that the idea of partition was decided by senior British policymakers at the level of high politics, often in private spaces behind closed doors. So in 1916, David Lloyd George negotiations with Redmond and Carson. 1917, the Irish Convention held in private, albeit with a range of stakeholders, in which the proceedings were not disclosed to the public. That was at Trinity College, Dublin. 1921, the fate of Ulster and the idea of partition was being discussed behind closed doors in London during the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And the ultimate arbiter of this boundary of partition was decided in 1925 at high political level in the terms of the Boundary Commission. Now, in contradistinction, I would argue, to this high-level private politics, our contributors have evoked what I've previously termed alternative Ulsters. And by that I mean alternative dates, or other themes, new perspectives, which evoke ideas of Ulster and partition from below in public spaces. Just to highlight two examples from our volume, Peter Leary's essay entitled Closing Border Roads attests to a kind of a dialectic between different competing forces of where the border should lie, whereby A and B specials essentially contested local spaces with local people by essentially establishing blockages and roads, filling roads to try and demarcate where the border was, away from the high politics of Craig and others. And he remarks, for a century, the Irish border has been contested not merely in the realms of politics and ideology, but also in the everyday struggles of many within border communities. And I think that idea of partition being contested, not at the level of high politics solely, but on the ground by local people in the realm of social and cultural practices, again attests to this idea of postmodern Ireland. You could also, as Margaret did, emphasise the work of Tim Wilson, who uses the event of the Craig Collins Pact on the 30th of March 1922, well established in the existing historiography, by instead focusing on the efforts of local communities who endeavoured to bring about peace and conciliation, especially in the wake of bitter sectarian violence, which marked politics in Ulster between 1920 and 1922, in what he talked about as wider experiments in conflict reduction. And he concludes, when cycles of violence petered out into fragile standoffs, local peace conferences attempted to consolidate these. However ineffectively institutionalized, they bear witness to the resilience of informal mechanisms of conflict de-escalation at local level. So I think in those emphases of history from below, our contributors, in the best sense, have emphasised the agency of individuals who will otherwise be written out of the politics, the history of Thai politics. Secondly, I'd also like to address the issue of diaspora, which may seem a contradiction in terms, given that many of our ideas are focused on the issue of civil war, which would suggest a focus on intranationalist politics and divisions. Now, the Irish Civil War, I would argue, altered the outlook of Irish nationalism, narrowing the focus of Irish revolutionaries from a global Ireland to a more island-centred politics, and diverting attention from the scale of Republican international achievements to the minutiae of intranational differences. A century of independent, stated and historical scholarship has reinforced the quote-unquote ourselves alone narrative of the Irish Revolution. The separation of the Irish diaspora from the historiography of the Irish Revolution to date speaks to what I would term the double marginalisation of the Irish migrant from Irish society and from its historical record. In this volume, our contributors have argued, or written rather, against that historical slant. 7 essays of our 50 are on the subject of the Irish diaspora, ranging from the Irish in Great Britain to the Irish in Australia. And I think it speaks to the continued and persistent engagement of the Irish diaspora in questions of Irish nationalism and beyond. Just to highlight a few, Enda Delaney, who writes about St. Patrick's Day in New York City on the 17th of March 1922, emphasises the political of the role of the Irish diaspora remaining important. And in fact, identifies the Irish diaspora as being one of the kind of unique signifiers or markers of the Irish Revolution in comparative terms to other revolutionary movements. Diane Hall similarly talks about the distance of the Irish in Australia, both physically but also psychologically, from the events going on in Ireland, which we are so accustomed to. The proximity of events in 1922 is proximate to Irish historians, but that distance, not only to the people of 100 years ago, but to the scholars who write about them, creates a different form of writing, I would argue, from the diaspora perspective. And I think it is noteworthy, both in this volume and beyond, the extent to which innovative, insightful, theoretical approaches to the idea of modern Ireland have been generated to a considerable extent by scholars beyond the island, who by definition do not have access to the sources which we have on this island. So I think that's an important aspect to emphasize. I would like to conclude my remarks on diaspora just with a series of questions which I think this volume has suggested to me on conclusion. Going forward as scholars of Ireland, global Ireland in fact, how can we make accessible sources of migration between Ireland and the Irish diaspora? How can we make tangible the lived experiences of global Irish migrants? And how can we make representative 21st century varieties of Irishness? And I just want to conclude very briefly, and I think this is, speaks to the volume's significance beyond Ireland 1922, if I may. In many respects, this year will be a year, commemoratively speaking, of disillusionment. Foremost amongst that, I think, will be the issue of the destruction of the Public Record Office in June of 1922, correctly identified as one of the great losses in Irish archival culture to mark the beginning of the Irish Civil War. But I think this volume, in its complexity, in its multidisciplinary nature, in its beautiful colour and resolution, brings out new sources and new opportunities for scholars of Ireland and beyond to think about opportunities in 2022 for restoring alternative sources to the Irish historical record. And by that I mean the proliferation of alternative historical sources such as material culture, visual culture, memorial culture, and oral culture, which attest, I would argue, to the valence of both post-colonial and postmodern approaches to Irish history. In short, I hope, as a document in postmodern Irish history, that this volume will offer a case study in our archival alterity. To conclude, Ireland 1922 was a remarkable year. It was a year of difference, it was a year of division. But overall, I believe that it was a year of opportunity in which we can think about the differences of Irish politics 100 years ago. 1922 was a year in short, is a long time in revolutionary politics. Thank you.
Okay, Dara, thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions. So it's slightly difficult to do given the the kind of hybrid nature. So what we're going to do is invite questions both from the floor and from online. So if you're here in the room and you want to ask a question, just put your hand up, and then just because you want to pick up the question at the front, you want to take off your mask if you're wearing one and project your voice a bit. If you want to ask a question and you're online, you should see on your Teams screen there's a little icon with a hand and a face. It should be at the top of your screen. You press that button and then press the hand button. That just indicates you're raising your hand digitally. Then I'll invite you to ask your question. If we can keep questions short, there might be a bit of a problem just with people either online or in the room picking up what's being said, so I may need to repeat the questions. So if you keep them short, that would be very helpful. But without further ado, let's open it up. So who wants to start? If somebody wants to begin our discussion. instructions were overcomplicated.
I'll ask a
Margaret,
question. You suggested to people that they write something about 1922, the topic to be chosen by themselves. Were you any more specific than that?
We thought for a long time about the form the book should take and the different ways in which we could do the book. And we eventually decided that looking at 50 events in 1922 would be much more interesting than something just spanning the revolutionary period. You know, it would be a little fresher and looking forward rather than back. And the idea of just sort of coming up with some list of 50 of the most important events to have short essays on just seemed very unappealing, you know, intellectually. But what we wanted the book to reflect was that there's just been so much brilliant writing in history, but also in other disciplines, that has been brought to the fore by the decade of centenaries. And so we figured maybe the best way of doing that would be to think about really great writers, historians, anthropologists, political scientists, whatever, and to ask them to identify their own event that could help to explain a key theme, a key insight in their research and in the literature. So we gave most people, like an extraordinarily vague request, which is, can you think of something in 22 that will allow you to talk about, say, the importance of emotions or the concept of forgetting, or whatever the particular theme or methodology that we wanted them to raise. And there were some pros and cons with that have already been pointed out by some reviewers. There are some events there that you might expect to be there that aren't there. You know, when Michael Collins dies, there's nothing in the book, you know. But on the other hand, it allowed us to really write a book that would be driven kind of more intellectually than event-wise. You know, Dara, you wanted to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's really important is that while it is a calendar of sorts in 1922, you can pick up the book on a given day in the year kind of thing and see what was going on in Ireland in 1922. Ultimately, the book, I think you agree, was driven by themes. We were really interested in kind of what this book could say about the revolutionary period more broadly, but also the kind of revolution, you may say, in Irish historiography, which has been undertaken in the last 10 years, democratization of sources, digitization of sources, the multidisciplinary nature of the contributions and so on. So while Michael Collins does not get a specific date in our commemorative calendar, which has been pointed out in the reviews, it nonetheless speaks to the experiences of people at that time. So there are, for example, other essays in August of 1922 which speak to the reopening of Cleary's, which was front page news, you know, before Michael Collins' assassination. So we're giving equal weighting to things like social history, cultural history, in addition to the more familiar kind of events really of that time. And hopefully that speaks to, as you said, Margaret, moving away into a more collaborative way of writing this period moving forward.
I think the only three themes where we really specifically, there may have been more, but the three that come to mind where we specifically wanted essays were on the treaty debates, because it marks that theme of state formation, on the outbreak of the Civil War, so the Four Courts essay, and also on partition, because they were the three themes that we thought most contributors would, and we asked contributors to reflect on. I mean, not all the essays do. I mean, if you've got essays on, say, religious belief or shopping or whatever, they don't particularly, but they were the themes that run through most of the book. And so some aspects of the book were kind of serendipity, really. For example, we didn't know where different essays would cluster chronologically, but you can actually see periods like late spring, where the intensity of events means that there's a lot of really kind of difficult essays. So that was, you know, an unplanned aspect of how it shook out.
Interesting. Okay, thanks. Yes, question to the phone.
Thanks for a really good book, although I haven't actually read it yet. Reviews. My question is more of a pointed question, specific question, about a key figure in the book. Such a key figure is pretty much marginalised and forgotten about, but nothing. Arthur Griffith. Why is it, do you think, that Arthur Griffith has not probably been remembered as prominently as difficult?
Sure. Thank you so much for your kind comments. I mean, there are two separate questions there, I think, really. We do have an essay which deals with the death of Arthur Griffith. Ewan O'Halpin has written on that. The Death of a Statesman, it's entitled, and I think that actually is probably one of the surprising things about the volume to many readers, is that we mark in that respect the death of Griffith rather than Collins. So I think that's some way, restoring that balance. I think your question is a good one, and I suppose the cult of Collins still resonates to this day. That image of Collins in military uniform defined, many ideas of the Civil War. I think it speaks to what Fearghal alluded to, the idea of the kind of pro-treaty position. In a single image, the image of Collins is so attractive, so dominant, that it could almost evoke that kind of the sense of the victory of Sinn Féin, as Peter Hegarty spoke about it. Griffith was less charismatic, was more, he was kind of behind the scenes. He didn't necessarily stand for the new ideas of the Irish Free State and so on. Also, his papers are kind of not as available as, let's say, Collins's, for example. So there is that sense of Griffith being restored to history. Certainly during the treaty centenary, the tail end of last year, Griffith was very much to the fore, which I think is absolutely correct. But I think what we try and do is show how those myths of the great statesmen, for example, were constructed. And for example, the Lavery portrait of Collins, the lying in state evokes that image, the cult of Collins, whereas there is no such image of Griffith lying in state. So I think we try to move away from those totemic representations and explore the quotidian and the many varieties of Irishness, as I mentioned before.
Yeah, just to add to that, it's a good question about how, because one of the things you do when you're constructing a book which is like around a conceit of contemporaneously going through the year, you see that some people were more important than they are now remembered, and vice versa. And Griffith Collins is a really good example of that. I mean, Ewan O'Halpin's essay is one of the few biographical essays. There's also one in De Valera, and he makes the point that Griffith's death was seen as a really significant event by international press coverage. It's discussed all over the world, and he was seen as this like a really important figure in terms of his political ideas. And there's other figures who pop up a lot in the book who are no longer remembered by people outside, I think, professional history circles, like Mary McSweeney, but they're really important back then, but they were subsequently kind of written out of importance. And I think it's really interesting in terms of your question and what Dara was saying, that Collins figures, I mean, Collins was obviously a really important historical figure, but he figures in this book in very important ways as an icon. We have an amazing photograph of his funeral, and it brings out sort of masses of people. He figures as a subject of art and memorialization and so on. So in a sense, his importance is remembered in different ways, but it sort of grows over time, because of what he comes to symbolize as much as what he did. Whereas Griffiths just doesn't get any traction with kind of, public memory for a whole load of complicated reasons, but that's, he's largely forgotten.
Okay, Fearghal, thanks very much. We've got a question from Lucy online. Lucy McDermott, unmute and ask.
Yeah, hi. Am I audible? Everybody?
Yeah, I'll repeat, Lucy, if we can't hear you.
Excuse me?
Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. First of all, this was really very edifying, a really wonderful session. I just wanted to add a literary note to support what Dara was saying about the smaller scale of comments on partition. There's a whole lot of poetry about the border. Poems by Paul Muldoon, poems by Colette Bryce. And one thing that's noticeable about the poems is that the scale in which the border is commented on gets smaller and smaller. And Paula Cunningham has a poem about a house that's right on the border, such that the woman who lives there eats her breakfast in the north, but brushes her teeth in the south. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, so Lucy's point is about poetry of the border and how there's a significant body of poetry around the border that has developed over time, and how important it is to capture that in a publication like yours.
Yeah, so I can't really speak specifically to the poetry of the border, but it was really important for us to get a range of, cultural forms in the book. But again, one of the first questions we got about this is about kind of omissions. Casey isn't there, theatre isn't there.
And this partly was due to who we asked, but the themes that we come up, and some of the themes that are really quite interesting. Art music is there because there was a forgotten musical performance at the global. What's the name of the global
Irish Race Congress?
The Irish Race Congress, dedicated to Terence McSweeney, but the essay makes the point that Irish music just didn't gain traction as a vehicle for nationalism in the way that theatre had. So theatre is much more remembered. Film is there, but primarily in the form of film censorship, which I think is interesting, because sometimes we think this is 1920s and 30s is a very repressive Catholic Ireland that sort of rolls back the revolution. But right during the revolution, there were many nationalists and Republicans, including people who we might think as radicals or on the left, like Countess Markievicz, who were fully in favour of kind of having a nationalist, moralistically more conservative kind of artistic output that would reflect the values of the revolution. Poetry does feature with a brilliant essay from Roy Foster about the Civil War, and he makes the point, and I see Shifra Aiken is in the audience too, that while maybe within history the Civil War wasn't debated very explicitly, but it was reflected through poetry, through fiction, and other kind of forms, which everyone, including historians, can use as a source, which Shifra does so well in her fantastic new book. And the final kind of cultural representation that I can think of that comes apart from art is Ulysses is mentioned, but as a really interesting article which explores everyday forms of popular culture in Dublin, including forms of music that perhaps rightly have been forgotten now, such as blacking up and American kind of music hall acts and so on. So there's some really interesting, again, it's this theme of, I think, looking at contemporaneously what people were doing is kind of an interesting question to ask. Whereas I think for some things like poetry, it might be maybe over time that a canon develops, which is seen as more significant. But we wanted to capture some sense of what is actually happening at the time.
Okay, do I have any other questions from the hall? Anyone desperate to ask something to our editors or to Margaret? Well, yes.
I'm curious if you have an essays in the volume that relates to the trajectory of business communities, or were there any business sectors involved in the volume, and what kind of the text synopsis of that?
Not that I can think of straight away of business.
Jason Kinner.
Jason Kinner deals with unemployment in Dáil Éireann and aspects of finance as part of his essay. And I think that's a really important aspect of this, that, you know, there is that famous quote which we have in the introduction. Kevin O'Higgins talks about, you know, the young Free State being kind of young men, you know, standing amidst the ruins of one administration with another not yet laid, and with wild men screaming through the keyhole. And he really evokes the pressures on the Irish Free State in terms of developing this administration, you know, amid the ruins of the Civil War and so on. The other essay which I was going to refer to, of course, which I think evokes in the context of Northern Ireland and Ulster, was what I referred to earlier, which was Tim Wilson's discussion of peace committees or conciliation committees in Northern Ireland. And he really emphasises not only is this peace from below in the Troubles, as it calls it, in early 1920s, but how business interests were central to those initiatives, how local business people on both sides of religious divides came together, I mean, ostensibly to try and preserve peace and tranquility and so on, but also to preserve their business interests in the putative Northern Ireland. And so there were kind of local brokerages going on at that time. And I just wanted to come back as well to the previous question, which I think there's also the issue of the idea of Northern Ireland and the idea of the, you know, Northern Ireland in moving forward. And Stephen O'Neill evokes a painting which speaks to the idea of the industry of Northern Ireland, and that James Craig was very keen on presenting Northern Ireland as open for business, where the Southern Ireland was kind of, you know, engaged in recrimination and bitter civil war, that it was open for business. And so there are shoots of kind of you know, entrepreneurial insights in the volume. And I think those are really important to recognise that, again, as Fearghal mentioned in his opening remarks, you know, daily life was going on, and even though people didn't know what would transpire going into 1923, you know, the politics of daily life had to continue. So I think that is threaded throughout the book at a very subtle level.
Just to add to that, I mean, it's interesting that economic history, economic ideas are part of the sort of the revolutionary ferment, particularly going back to the early 20th century. You know, look at someone like Arthur Griffith and the ideas that nationalism can unleash a kind of economic productivity. But interestingly, a lot of those ideas seem to dissipate in almost immediately in 1922, and that's kind of the point of Knirk's essay, which looks at one particular Doyle debate. And well, now that we have independence, how do we have a nationalist economy, a nationalist informed kind of economic policy? And there's just no answer to that. It's not, does it mean tariffs, does it mean protectionism, does it mean free trade? You know, that's when a lot of kind of confusion sets in, and it parallels an essay by Martin McGuire which looks at the civil service and administration, and he makes the point that there was always an assumption that with independence you would then sort of reinvent administration and civil service and have something that works for a small state. But because of the circumstances in which the state came into being with the Civil War, that went out the window, and we just basically had a small version of the British civil service, and had the state itself then wasn't kind of restructured in an imaginative way. So, I mean, I think looking back on it, I think we maybe could have done more to represent economic history, but it's kind of telling that those kind of issues get lost sight of in the immediate kind of need to sort of get a state up and running, and some of the first decisions which are still kind of remembered to some extent are things like cutting tax, cutting old age pensions and so on, with this kind of prioritization of getting a state that functions and appears respectable, you know, in outward terms, which is kind of interesting. That economic vision, which was such an important part of self-determination and the sort of the cultural nationalist revival, sort of dissipated.
Okay, well, it's great to be in this room, obviously in the Great Hall in Queen's. We are having some audio problems, so I think I might just wind up our Q&A session there. There'll be an opportunity for those of you in the hall to ask questions directly to the editors in just a minute. For those of you who joined us online, thank you very much for joining us and for participating. We're going to let you go now. We have wine and books in the room, which unfortunately we can't share with you, much as we'd like to. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope that you'll join us at another Irish Studies seminar in the future. For those of you who are in the room, we have some wine at the back. Please have a glass. We also have books, courtesy of No Alibis, at the back, discounted to £25. Which they'll take off you very happily and give you a copy of the book in return. And you'll have an opportunity to have a with the co-editors now. So thank you all very much. We give perhaps Margaret and Fearghal and Dara.